I came home early from work to surprise my wife. Instead, I found clothes leading up the stairs to our bedroom. I sat in my recliner with my gun, waiting for them to finish. You know how they say life can change in a heartbeat? Well, that's a load of crap. Life doesn't change in a heartbeat. It shatters in the time it takes to turn a doorknob. And let me tell you, I should have seen it coming. Hell, maybe I did see it coming and just chose to ignore all the red flags waving in my face like I was some kind of damn matador. That Friday afternoon started out perfect. I'm talking magazine cover perfect. I'd wrapped up the Henderson case early, got that poor bastard off on a technicality that would have made Perry Mason proud, and I was feeling like I could conquer the world. The sun was shining through my corner office windows, casting those golden rays that make you feel like you're living in some Hollywood movie. I had my weekend all mapped out, every detail planned to perfection. Santorini. 2 first-class tickets tucked safely in my briefcase. The honeymoon suite at that boutique hotel overlooking the Aegean Sea that Talia had bookmarked on her laptop about 100 times. And the necklace. Jesus Christ, that necklace. 3 months' salary sitting in a velvet box in my jacket pocket. This delicate white gold chain with a diamond pendant that caught the light like trapped starfire. She'd stood in front of that jewelry store window for 20 minutes last month, her breath fogging up the glass as she pressed her nose against it like some kid at a candy shop. "It's beautiful," she'd whispered, and I'd made a mental note right then and there. Our 5th anniversary deserved something special. She deserved something special. Or so I thought. I left the office at 2:30, which was practically unheard of for me. My secretary, Mrs. Chun, actually looked concerned when I told her to reschedule my Monday appointments. "Everything all right, Mr. Briggs?" she asked, peering at me over those reading glasses that made her look like a concerned librarian. I just grinned and told her I was surprising my wife. The word wife tasted sweet in my mouth back then. Funny how quickly that can change. The drive home through downtown Chicago was smooth sailing. Traffic was light for a Friday, and I had the radio cranked up, singing along to some classic rock station like I didn't have a care in the world. I even stopped at that fancy wine shop on Michigan Avenue and picked up a bottle of that expensive French champagne Talia loved, the one that cost more than most people's car payments. Money wasn't an object when it came to her happiness. It never had been. Our brownstone looked perfect as I pulled into the driveway. The lawn was immaculate. I'd paid good money for that landscaping service, and the autumn flowers Talia had planted were still blooming in the window boxes. Everything looked exactly like it should in our picture-perfect life. I remember thinking about how lucky I was as I walked up those front steps, keys jingling in my hand, already imagining the look on her face when I surprised her with the trip. That's when my perfect world went straight to hell. The front door wasn't locked. That should have been my first clue, but I was too caught up in my romantic fantasy to pay attention. Talia always locked the door. Always. It was practically a religion with her after that break-in scare we'd had 2 years ago. But there I was, turning the handle and stepping into our foyer like some clueless schmuck in a bad movie. The shoes hit me first. Men's dress shoes. Size 11, maybe 12. Italian leather, expensive looking. Not mine. Definitely not mine. They were just sitting there by the door like they belonged, like some other man had every right to make himself comfortable in my house. My heart started doing this weird stuttering thing, but I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was Jerome, my law partner. Maybe he'd stopped by to discuss a case. But Jerome wore sneakers. Always sneakers. Then I saw the shirt. Navy blue, button down, hanging off the banister like some kind of sick breadcrumb trail. My mouth went dry as dust. Next came a bra. Black lace. One I'd bought for Talia last Valentine's Day. It was draped over the bottom step like it had been tossed there in a hurry, and seeing it there, in that context, made my stomach twist into knots. The jeans were next. Women's jeans. Talia's jeans. The ones that hugged her curves just right. The ones I loved seeing her in. They were crumpled on the 4th step. And that's when the reality of what I was looking at finally sank in. This wasn't some innocent explanation. This was a trail. A goddamn trail leading upstairs to my bedroom. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, staring up those stairs like they led to the gates of hell. Part of me wanted to charge up there, burst through the bedroom door, and confront whatever nightmare was waiting for me. But another part, the lawyer part, the strategic part, told me to slow down, to think, to be smart about this. So I walked into the den, my legs feeling like they were made of lead, and I grabbed my old leather recliner. That chair had been my grandfather's, passed down through 3 generations of Briggs men. It was heavy as hell, but adrenaline is a powerful thing. I dragged it across the hardwood floor, the legs scraping and squealing like nails on a chalkboard, and positioned it right at the bottom of the staircase. Then I went to the safe. My hands were surprisingly steady as I spun the combination, Talia's birthday, because I was that kind of fool, and pulled out my .45. The gun felt cold and familiar in my hands. I'd had it for years, ever since that case where I'd gotten death threats from some gangbangers' crew. I kept it clean, kept it loaded, kept it ready. Just in case. Well, this was definitely a just-in-case moment. I settled into that old recliner, the leather creaking under my weight, and stared up at the ceiling. I could hear them now. Voices. Laughter. The sound of my marriage dying one giggle at a time. The gun sat heavy in my lap, and I wasn't sure what I was planning to do with it. I wasn't a violent man by nature. I was a lawyer, for Christ's sake. I solved problems with words, not bullets. But sitting there in that chair, listening to my wife destroying everything we'd built together, I felt something cold and calculating settle over me like a blanket. I needed to know. I needed to see. I needed to understand exactly how deep this betrayal went. So I waited, patient as a spider in its web, ready for whatever came down those stairs. You'd think a man finding out his wife is cheating would lose his mind, right? Start screaming, throwing things, maybe punch a hole in the wall like some kind of suburban Incredible Hulk. But here's the thing about betrayal. Real betrayal, the kind that cuts you down to the bone. It doesn't make you crazy. It makes you cold. Ice cold. And sitting in that recliner, listening to the sounds of my marriage being flushed down the toilet upstairs, I felt something settle over me that was scarier than rage. I felt calm. Dead calm. The kind of calm that comes right before a hurricane hits, when the air gets thick and everything goes still. That's exactly what was happening inside my head. All the noise, all the emotion, all the hurt, it just went quiet. Like someone had hit the mute button on my soul. I shifted my weight in the chair, the old leather groaning beneath me. And that's when I noticed the coffee table. Our beautiful glass coffee table that Talia had spent 3 weeks picking out, the one that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And sitting on top of it, like they owned the damn place, were his things. A brown leather wallet. Expensive looking, the kind that screams, "I've got money and I want everyone to know it." And next to it, a cell phone in one of those fancy cases that probably cost more than most people spend on groceries. This son of a bitch had been here before. That hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment thing, some, oops, we got carried away bullshit that Talia might try to sell me later. No, this bastard was comfortable enough in my house to just toss his personal belongings around like he lived here. Like he belonged here. Like he had every right to make himself at home while he screwed my wife in the bed I paid for. The phone was face up, and I could see notifications lighting up the screen every few minutes. Text messages, missed calls, the usual digital noise that follows us around like electronic shadows these days. But one name kept popping up over and over again. Home. Someone was trying to reach this piece of garbage, and they were getting pretty damn insistent about it. I reached over and picked up the phone, surprised by how steady my hands were. You'd think they'd be shaking, right? But they weren't. They were rock solid, like I was performing surgery or defusing a bomb. The screen was locked, but iPhones show you just enough to be dangerous. I could see partial messages, timestamps, missed call notifications. And that contact name, Home, it was listed as the primary emergency contact. His wife. This bastard had a wife. That realization hit me like a freight train loaded with irony. Here I was, sitting in my house with a gun in my lap, waiting to confront my cheating wife and her lover, and it turns out the other man was married too. Some poor woman out there was probably wondering why her husband wasn't answering his phone, maybe getting dinner ready, maybe helping kids with homework, completely clueless that her world was about to implode just like mine. I stared at that phone for what felt like forever, watching it light up with another missed call from home. The preview showed part of a text message. "Where are you? Kids are asking." And that was all I could see. But it was enough. More than enough. Before I could second-guess myself, I swiped to answer the next call that came in. The phone barely rang once before a woman's voice came through, sharp and irritated. "Reed, where the hell have you been? I've been calling you for 2 hours." "Reed." So that was his name. Reed. It sounded like the kind of name that belonged to some preppy asshole from the country club, the type who wore boat shoes without socks and thought he was God's gift to womankind. Ma'am, I said, keeping my voice level and professional. Years of courtroom experience had taught me how to stay calm under pressure. This isn't Reed. There was a pause. A long, loaded pause that stretched between us like a tightrope. Who is this? Her voice had changed. Gone was the irritation, replaced by something sharper. Suspicion. Fear, maybe. My name is Malcolm Briggs, I said, each word deliberate and clear. And I'm sitting in my living room, holding your husband's phone. Another pause. I could hear her breathing, could practically feel her mind racing, trying to process what I'd just told her. Where's Reed? She asked, and her voice had gotten smaller. Quieter, like she already knew the answer, but needed to hear it anyway. Upstairs, I said. In my bedroom. With my wife. The silence that followed was deafening. It stretched on for so long, I thought she might have hung up. But then I heard something that surprised me. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She didn't start screaming or demanding explanations. Instead, she laughed. It was a bitter, hollow sound that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with recognition. Son of a bitch, she whispered, and I could hear years of suspicion and doubt crystallizing into certainty in those 3 words. Ma'am, I'm sorry you had to find out this way, I said, and I meant it. Whatever Reed had done to his marriage, however many lies he'd told this woman, she didn't deserve to discover the truth from a stranger holding her husband's phone. Dana, she said. My name is Dana, and don't apologize. I've been waiting for this call for 3 years. 3 years. Jesus Christ. How long had Reed been pulling this shit? How many other wives were there? How many other families had this bastard torn apart with his wandering dick and his expensive Italian shoes? What are you going to do? Dana asked, and there was something in her voice that made me sit up straighter. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pleading. It was something else entirely. I haven't decided yet, I said, which was the truth. The gun was still in my lap, cold and heavy and full of possibilities I wasn't ready to explore. Well, when you figure it out, Dana said, her voice getting harder with each word. You tell that worthless piece of shit not to bother coming home. Tell him I'll be waiting with divorce papers and a restraining order. The line went dead, leaving me alone with the sound of my own breathing and the muffled voices still drifting down from upstairs. I set the phone back on the coffee table, right where I'd found it, and settled back into my chair. Reed's wife, ex-wife, apparently, had just given me something I hadn't expected. Permission. Not that I needed anyone's permission to handle my own business, but knowing that Dana was on my side, that she was ready to burn Reed's world down just as completely as he'd burned mine, well, that changed things. That made this whole situation a lot more interesting. There's something almost theatrical about the moment your life falls apart. Like you're watching it happen from the balcony seats while some other poor bastard plays your role down on stage. That's exactly how I felt sitting in that recliner, the .45 heavy in my hands, waiting for the final act of my marriage to come stumbling down those stairs. The sounds from upstairs had gotten louder over the past few minutes. Not just voices anymore, but movement. Footsteps. The creak of floorboards that I knew by heart. The loose one near the dresser, the squeaky spot by the bathroom door. These were the intimate sounds of my own house being violated, and each one felt like a needle sliding under my skin. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Laughter. Giggles, actually. High-pitched, breathless giggles that I recognized immediately as Talia's. The same laugh she used to make when I'd surprise her with flowers or tell her a stupid joke. The same laugh that used to make my chest tighten with love was now making my finger tighten on the trigger. But I wasn't some hothead. I wasn't going to go off half-cocked like some character in a bad action movie. I was Malcolm Briggs, criminal defense attorney, master of self-control and calculated decisions. So I did what any rational man would do in this situation. I clicked off the safety with a sound that seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot itself. The metallic click was crisp and final, the kind of sound that changes everything. It's funny how such a small noise can carry so much weight, so much promise of violence. I'd heard that sound 1,000 times at the shooting range, but sitting in my living room with my marriage dissolving above my head, it sounded different. Heavier, more real. The footsteps upstairs stopped for just a second. Complete silence. Even the house itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. It was the kind of silence that comes right before an earthquake, when all the animals go quiet and the air gets thick with electricity. I could feel it pressing against my eardrums like I was underwater. Then the floorboards creaked again, and I heard them coming down the stairs. Talia appeared first, and Jesus Christ, she looked exactly like what she was. A woman who'd just been thoroughly screwed by someone who wasn't her husband. Her dark hair was tousled in that way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with passion. She was wearing that silk robe I'd bought her for Christmas, the emerald green one that brought out her eyes. It was hanging open just enough to be scandalous, and her skin had that flushed glow that I used to love seeing on lazy Sunday mornings. But when her eyes met mine, when she saw me sitting there in that chair with the gun across my lap, everything about her changed. The satisfied smile vanished. The lazy, post-sex contentment evaporated like steam. Her green eyes went wide with something that was part shock, part fear, and part guilt so thick you could cut it with a knife. "Malcolm," she whispered, and my name coming out of her mouth sounded like a prayer or a curse. Maybe both. Her hand went to her throat, fingers finding the pulse point there like she was checking to make sure her heart was still beating. That's when Reed stumbled into view behind her, and I got my first good look at the son of a bitch who'd been screwing my wife. He was exactly what I'd expected, mid-30s, probably worked out religiously, the kind of guy who thought his abs gave him the right to take whatever he wanted. His chest was bare, revealing one of those carefully sculpted physiques that screamed, "I spend more time at the gym than I do with my family." His dark hair was messed up in that same telling way as Talia's, and he had that smug, satisfied expression that some men get after they think they've conquered something. At least, he had that expression until he saw the gun. I watched the color drain from his face like someone had pulled a plug. It was actually kind of fascinating from a psychological standpoint, the way his arrogant smirk melted into confusion, then understanding, then pure, undiluted terror. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, and I could practically see his brain trying to process the situation he'd just walked into. "Malcolm, wait." Talia's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a scream. She took a step toward me, one hand extended like she was approaching a wild animal. Which, come to think of it, wasn't that far from the truth. I didn't say anything, didn't move. Just sat there staring at them both, taking in every detail of this moment that would be burned into my memory forever. The way Talia's robe had slipped off one shoulder. The way Reed's hands were trembling at his sides. The way they both looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world than standing on my staircase, caught red-handed in the act of destroying my life. Reed finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than actual speech. "Look, man, I can explain." But he never got the chance to finish that sentence, because that's when something inside me snapped. Not into rage. I was still ice cold, still in complete control. But something deeper than anger, something that had been building since I first saw those Italian leather shoes by my front door. Reed must have seen it in my eyes, because he suddenly spun around like he was going to run back up the stairs. Like he could somehow escape this situation by retreating to the scene of the crime. The coward actually thought he could run away from what he'd done. That's when I pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space of my foyer. The .45 kicked back against my palm with familiar authority, and the bullet tore into the wooden banister about 6 inches from Reed's head. Splinters exploded in every direction, and the smell of gunpowder filled the air like incense in a very different kind of church. Both Talia and Reed screamed. High, piercing sounds that probably woke up half the neighborhood. Reed dove forward, hitting the stairs hard enough to bruise, while Talia pressed herself against the wall like she was trying to meld into it. The echo of the gunshot seemed to go on forever, bouncing off the walls and ceiling before finally fading into a silence that was somehow even more profound than before. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady as a metronome. I could hear Talia's ragged breathing. I could hear Reed whimpering like a kicked dog. "That," I said, my voice perfectly calm and conversational, "was your warning shot." The aftermath of a gunshot is something you can't really prepare for, even when you're the one pulling the trigger. The silence that follows is different from regular silence. It's got weight to it, substance, like the air itself has been traumatized. And in that loaded quiet, with the smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air like a threat, I watched two people I thought I knew transform into something else entirely. Reed was pressed against the stairs like he was trying to become part of the wood, his chest heaving like he'd just run a marathon. Sweat was pouring down his face, mixing with what might have been tears, though I doubted this particular specimen was capable of genuine emotion. His perfectly sculpted abs were contracting with each panicked breath, and I found myself thinking that all those hours in the gym hadn't prepared him for this kind of workout. Talia was frozen against the wall, her silk robe clutched closed with white-knuckled fists. Her green eyes, the same eyes I'd stared into on our wedding day while promising to love and cherish her till death do us part, were wide with terror. But underneath that fear, I could see something else. Calculation. She was already trying to figure out how to spin this, how to minimize the damage, how to make this somehow not her fault. That's when I realized I was looking at strangers. These weren't the people I thought I'd been living with, loving, building a life alongside. These were actors who'd been playing roles, and I'd been too blind or too trusting or too goddamn stupid to see through their performance. "Nobody moves," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Nobody speaks unless I ask them a direct question. And nobody, and I mean nobody, tries to leave this house until I get some answers." They both nodded frantically, looking like bobblehead dolls in the back window of some teenager's car. Good. Fear was useful. Fear made people honest, and honesty was exactly what I needed right now. I shifted in the recliner, the leather creaking beneath me, and kept the gun trained in their general direction, not pointing directly at either of them. I wasn't completely unhinged, but close enough that they knew I meant business. "How long?" I asked, looking directly at Talia. As she opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again like she was practicing some kind of verbal gymnastics routine. When she finally found her voice, it came out as barely a whisper. "Malcolm, I can explain." I didn't ask for an explanation. I cut her off. I asked how long. "How long have you been screwing this piece of shit in our bed?" The words hung in the air between us like a physical thing, ugly and sharp-edged. Talia flinched like I'd slapped her, which was interesting because apparently being called out on her adultery hurt worse than actually committing it. 6 months, she whispered, and those two words hit me harder than the gunshot had hit that banister. 6 months. Half a year. That meant this had been going on during my birthday, during our trip to Napa Valley, during all those nights when she claimed she was working late or out with girlfriends or at book club. 6 months of lies, 6 months of deception, 6 months of me being the biggest sucker in Chicago. "Every business trip?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She nodded, tears starting to stream down her cheeks. But they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of someone who'd gotten caught. Someone who was sorry about the consequences, but not about the actions that led to them. "Where?" "Hotels, mostly." Reed spoke up for the first time since the gunshot, his voice shaky, but trying to sound reasonable. Like we were discussing the weather instead of the systematic destruction of my marriage. "Sometimes my place when Dana was." "I wasn't talking to you," I said, swinging the gun in his direction just enough to shut him up. "In fact, the only time I want to hear your voice is if you're bleeding out and need to confess your sins before you meet your maker." Reed's mouth snapped shut so fast I heard his teeth click together. I turned back to Talia, studying her face like I was seeing it for the first time. And in a way I was. The woman I'd married, the woman I'd loved for 7 years, was a stranger wearing a familiar mask. "Did you use protection?" I asked, and I watched her face cycle through confusion, embarrassment, and something that might have been shame. "I what?" "It's not a complicated question, Talia. When you were fucking this married piece of garbage, did you at least have the courtesy to use protection, or were you trying to give me some kind of parting gift?" Her face went pale, then flushed red, then pale again. "I was on the pill," she said quietly. I laughed. Actually laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because the alternative was putting a bullet through the wall, and I was trying to be civilized about this whole situation. "Oh, how thoughtful," I said, letting the sarcasm drip from every word. "So considerate. You were planning to keep screwing around indefinitely, but at least you didn't want to complicate things with an inconvenient pregnancy. Very practical. Very modern. Malcolm, please." "Please what? Please forgive you? Please pretend this never happened? Please pack up and leave so you two lovebirds can continue your affair without the messy complications of a husband getting in the way." She was sobbing now, ugly crying that made her mascara run down her cheeks in black streaks. But I felt nothing. No sympathy, no urge to comfort her, no desire to make her feel better. If anything, I felt disgusted that I'd ever been attracted to someone so weak, so selfish, so fundamentally dishonest. I looked at Reed, who was still trying to make himself invisible against the staircase. "How many others?" I asked. He looked confused, like the question was somehow unexpected. "What? How many other wives have you screwed? How many other marriages have you destroyed? Because a guy like you doesn't just wake up one day and decide to start cheating. This is a pattern, a lifestyle. So I want to know exactly how much of a piece of shit I'm dealing with." Reed's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like he was trying to do complex math in his head, which was probably exactly what he was doing. "Can't remember?" I asked conversationally. "That many, huh? Well, that's interesting. Very interesting indeed." I turned back to Talia, who was watching this exchange with growing horror, like she was finally understanding what kind of man she'd thrown her marriage away for. "One more question," I said to her. "Were you trying to get pregnant?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She actually staggered backward, pressing herself harder against the wall. "What? No. I told you, I was on the pill. That's not what I asked. I asked if you were trying to get pregnant. Were you hoping to get knocked up by Mr. Wonderful here, so you could divorce me and take half my money while claiming you needed child support for his bastard?" "Malcolm, that's horrible. I would never." "You would never what? Cheat on your husband? Lie to his face for 6 months? Bring your lover into our home, into our bed? Because you've already done all of those things, sweetheart. So forgive me if I don't take your word for what you would or wouldn't do." The fight went out of her then. I could actually see it happen, like someone had unplugged her batteries. Her shoulders sagged, her head dropped, and she slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, looking like a broken doll in an expensive silk robe. "I still love you," she whispered, and those 4 words made me angrier than anything else she could have said. That's when I laughed again. Really laughed this time. Deep belly laughs that echoed off the walls and seemed to go on forever. I laughed until my sides hurt, until tears streamed down my cheeks, until both Talia and Reed were staring at me like I'd completely lost my mind. Maybe I had. "You love me," I said when I could finally speak again. "That's rich. That's absolutely fucking rich. You love me so much that you've been screwing another man for 6 months. You love me so much that you brought him into our home, into our bed, on the day I was planning to surprise you with a trip to Santorini for our anniversary. You love me so much that you're willing to destroy everything we've built together for some cheap thrills with a serial cheater who can't even remember how many marriages he's wrecked." I stood up then, still holding the gun, and looked down at both of them like they were something I'd scraped off my shoe. "You know what, Talia? I don't think you understand what love actually means. Because love, real love, doesn't do this. Real love doesn't betray. Real love doesn't lie. Real love doesn't turn your whole life into a fucking joke. The woman I'd married, the woman I'd loved, the woman I'd built my entire adult life around, looked up at me from the floor with mascara-streaked cheeks and said nothing at all. Because there was nothing left to say. The truth was out now, hanging in the air between us like poison gas. And the taste of it was more bitter than I'd ever imagined. There's a moment in every man's life when he realizes that words aren't enough anymore. When all the talking, all the reasoning, all the civilized conversation in the world won't fix what's broken or make people understand the gravity of what they've done. I'd reached that moment about 30 seconds ago, and the cold clarity that came with it was almost beautiful in its simplicity. I picked up Reed's phone from the coffee table, the screen still lighting up with notifications from his increasingly frantic wife. Well, soon-to-be ex-wife, if Dana was as good as her word. The device felt heavier than it should have, weighted down with all the lies and betrayals it had facilitated over the past 6 months. "Take it," I said, holding the phone out toward Reed. He stared at me like I'd just offered him a live grenade, which, in a way, I had. "Take the goddamn phone, Reed." His hand shook as he reached for it, his fingers trembling so badly he nearly dropped it when our skin made contact. The touch made my skin crawl. The idea that this man's hands had been all over my wife, that his body had been pressed against hers, that he'd been inside her in ways that were supposed to be mine alone. The thought made my trigger finger itch. "Call your wife," I said, my voice steady as granite. Tell her where you are. Tell her what you've been doing. Tell her exactly what kind of man she married. Reed's face went even paler, if that was possible. He looked like a ghost wearing expensive cologne and too much hair gel. Look, man, I don't give a shit what you think. I cut him off. I'm not asking for your opinion. I'm not requesting your cooperation. I'm telling you what's going to happen. You're going to call Dana, and you're going to tell her the truth. All of it. She already knows, he stammered. You already told her. She knows you're here. She knows you're screwing my wife. But she doesn't know the details, does she? She doesn't know that you've been doing this for 6 months. She doesn't know that this isn't the first marriage you've helped destroy. She doesn't know that you're the kind of man who throws his wallet and phone around another man's house like you own the place. Reed's eyes darted toward the front door like he was calculating his chances of making a run for it. I could practically see the wheels turning in his head, weighing his options, trying to figure out if he was fast enough to reach the door before I could put a bullet in his back. Don't even think about it, I said conversationally. I was second in my class at the police academy shooting range before I decided law school was a better career path. I can put 3 rounds center mass before you take 2 steps. That killed whatever escape plan was forming in his brain. His shoulders sagged in defeat, and he looked down at the phone in his hands like it was his own death warrant. Please, he whispered. My kids. Your kids. I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. Yeah, let's talk about your kids. How old are they, Reed? He swallowed hard. 8 and 10. 8 and 10. So they're old enough to understand when Daddy doesn't come home anymore. Old enough to hear the neighbors whispering about what Daddy did to break up the family. Old enough to be ashamed of their last name when this whole mess becomes public record. I watched him process that, watched the reality of his situation sink in like water into sand. The affair hadn't just been about sex or excitement or whatever pathetic midlife crisis had driven him to my wife's bed. It had consequences, real consequences that would ripple through multiple families for years to come. You should have thought about your kids before you decided to stick your dick where it doesn't belong, I continued. But since you didn't, here we are. So make the call. Reed's hands were shaking so badly, he could barely work the phone. It took him 3 tries to find Dana's number in his contacts, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the fact that it wasn't particularly warm in the house. I can't, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. And that's when something inside me snapped. Not into rage. I was still cold, still controlled, still thinking clearly. But into action. Decisive, irreversible action that would make it crystal clear to everyone in this room that I wasn't fucking around anymore. I raised the .45 and put a bullet through Reed's left thigh. The gunshot was even louder this time, if that was possible. The sound seemed to bounce off every surface in the house, a thunderclap of violence that left my ears ringing and the air thick with cordite smoke. Reed's scream was somehow both higher and more guttural than I'd expected, the sound of a man who'd never experienced real pain before and had no idea how to process it. He went down hard, clutching his leg as blood began to seep through his fingers. The phone went skittering across the hardwood floor, coming to rest near Talia's feet. She was screaming too now, high-pitched shrieks that reminded me of a car alarm going off in the distance. Jesus Christ, Malcolm, she shrieked. You shot him. You actually shot him. I did. I agreed calmly, watching Reed writhe on my floor, his blood starting to stain the wood that Talia had spent so much time picking out. And I'll shoot him again if he doesn't start following instructions. Reed was making noises that weren't quite words, gasping and moaning and generally carrying on like someone had told him he was dying. Which he wasn't. I'd been careful to avoid the femoral artery, and the bullet had gone clean through the muscle. It hurt like hell, no doubt, but it wasn't life-threatening. I wasn't a murderer. Yet. The bullet went through. I explained to both of them, my voice as calm as if I was discussing the weather. Missed the major blood vessels. He'll live, assuming he doesn't go into shock from being a pussy about a little gunshot wound. I walked over to where the phone had landed and picked it up, then tossed it onto Reed's chest. It bounced off and fell beside him on the floor. Call your wife? I said again. Tell her where you'll be. Reed was still gasping and clutching his leg, but he managed to grab the phone with his free hand. His fingers left bloody smears on the screen as he tried to work it. I can't, it hurts. It's supposed to hurt, I said matter-of-factly. That's the point. Pain focuses the mind. helps you remember what's important. And what's important right now is that you call Dana and tell her the truth about what kind of man she married. Talia had stopped screaming and was now making these little whimpering sounds, like a puppy that had been kicked. She was staring at the blood on the floor with a look of absolute horror, like she'd never seen anything so shocking in her entire privileged life. "Malcolm," she whispered, "please, this has gone too far. We need to call 911. We need to get him to a hospital." "Oh, we're definitely calling 911, I said, already reaching for my own phone. "But not yet. First, Reed here is going to have a little conversation with his wife. Then he's going to explain to me exactly how many other marriages he's destroyed. And then, only then, am I going to call for an ambulance." I speed dialed 911, but didn't hit send yet. Just held the phone in my hand like a promise. Or a threat. "This is what's going to happen," I said, my voice calm and reasonable and absolutely terrifying in its measured tone. "I'm going to call the police and tell them there's been a shooting. I'm going to tell them that I came home to find my wife in bed with another man, and that I shot the intruder in self-defense when he threatened me." Reed tried to protest, but all that came out was a strangled wheeze. "I'm going to tell them that Reed here broke into my house, that he attacked me when I confronted him, and that I was forced to defend myself and my property. My word against his. And guess which one of us has a better reputation in this town?" I looked down at Reed, who was still bleeding all over my nice hardwood floors, and smiled. It wasn't a particularly pleasant smile. Of course, if Reed wants to tell a different story, he's welcome to try. But that would mean admitting to adultery, breaking and entering, and destroying multiple families. That would mean explaining to his kids why daddy is going to prison instead of just going through a messy divorce. I hit send on the 911 call. 911, what's your emergency?" "This is Malcolm Briggs at 1247 North Astor Street," I said, my voice perfectly calm and professional. "I need to report a shooting. An intruder broke into my home and threatened my family. I was forced to defend myself. Are you safe now, sir?" "Yes, the threat has been neutralized. The intruder is wounded but alive. I'll need an ambulance as well as police response. Units are on the way, sir. Please stay on the line." I looked down at Reed, who was staring up at me with a mixture of pain, fear, and something that might have been respect. Or maybe that was just blood loss making him delusional. "You know what the funny thing is?" I said to both of them as we waited for the sirens. "I was planning to surprise you with a trip to Santorini, Talia. Had the tickets in my briefcase, the hotel booked, even bought you that necklace you wanted. I was going to ask you to renew our vows on the beach where we honeymooned." I shook my head, genuinely amazed by the irony of it all. "Instead, I get to watch my marriage bleed out on the living room floor along with your boyfriend." The sirens were getting closer now, their wailing cutting through the evening air like mechanical wolves howling at the moon. Soon this house would be full of paramedics and cops and crime scene techs, all trying to piece together what had happened here. But I already knew what had happened. Justice had happened. Even if their own husbands had forgotten how to protect what was theirs. County jail isn't exactly the Ritz-Carlton, but it wasn't my first rodeo either. As a criminal defense attorney, I'd visited clients in lockup more times than I could count. Hell, I'd probably spent more hours in these concrete corridors than some of the guards. But there's a hell of a difference between walking through those doors with a briefcase and a visitor's badge versus walking through them in handcuffs with your shoelaces confiscated. The irony wasn't lost on me. 24 hours ago, I was Malcolm Briggs, Esquire, respected member of the Chicago Bar Association, owner of a corner office with a view of Lake Michigan. Now I was inmate 47291, sitting on a metal bench in an orange jumpsuit that smelled like industrial disinfectant and other people's desperation. But here's the thing about rock bottom. Once you hit it, you realize it's actually pretty solid ground to build on. And I had some serious building to do. The holding cell was exactly what you'd expect. Gray walls, fluorescent lights that hummed like angry insects, and the kind of silence that makes you think too much. I'd been processed, fingerprinted, photographed, and lectured by 3 different cops about my anger management issues. They'd taken my statement, which matched my 911 call word for word. Some asshole broke into my house, threatened my family, and got exactly what he deserved. Self-defense is a beautiful thing when you know how to sell it properly. The detective who interviewed me was a guy named Morrison, thick-necked and cynical in the way that comes from 20 years of listening to criminals lie to his face. He'd tried every trick in the book to get me to change my story, to admit that maybe I'd overreacted, that maybe shooting an unarmed man wasn't the most reasonable response to finding him in my house. But I hadn't gotten where I was by folding under pressure. I'd stuck to my story like gospel. I came home, found an intruder, felt threatened, defended myself. Period. End of story. The fact that the intruder happened to be screwing my wife was just an unfortunate coincidence that made the whole situation more emotionally charged. Morrison had tried the sympathy angle, the tough guy angle, even though we're both professionals here angle. Nothing worked. Because I knew something he didn't. In about 6 hours, my partner Jerome would post my bail, and I'd walk out of here a free man with a story that would hold up in court. The other inmates gave me a wide berth, which was fine by me. Word travels fast in jail, and apparently shooting a guy for breaking into your house earned you a certain amount of respect. Or maybe it was just that I carried myself like someone who wasn't afraid of the consequences of his actions. Either way, I had plenty of space to think. And thinking was exactly what I needed to do. The wheels in my head had been turning since the moment they'd slapped the cuffs on me. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Reed had fucked with the wrong man's life, and now I was going to return the favor with interest. But it had to be done smart, done legal, done in a way that would destroy him completely without giving him any ammunition to use against me. I was still working through the details when a guard came to fetch me. "Briggs, you made bail." Jerome was waiting for me in the lobby, looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past 24 hours. My law partner was a good man. Hell, he was probably my closest friend, but he wasn't built for this kind of drama. His usually perfect suit was wrinkled, his silver hair was disheveled, and he had the kind of bags under his eyes that came from a sleepless night spent worrying about his partner's sanity. "You okay?" he asked as we walked toward his BMW, and I could hear genuine concern in his voice. "Not yet," I said, because it was the truth. "But I will be." Jerome didn't push for details during the drive, which I appreciated. He'd been my partner for 8 years, and he knew me well enough to understand that I'd talk when I was ready. Instead, he filled me in on the practical matters. The media circus that had already formed outside my house. The preliminary hearing scheduled for next week. The fact that Reed was expected to make a full recovery from his unfortunate accident. "Talia moved out," he said as we pulled into my driveway. "Took what was hers and left. Didn't touch anything that belonged to you." I nodded. "Smart girl." The prenup I'd insisted on before we got married was airtight. She'd get what she'd brought into the marriage and not a penny more. 7 years of my life down the drain, but at least she wouldn't profit from the wreckage. Reed was discharged from the ER about an hour ago, Jerome continued. His wife Dana met him with divorce papers and a restraining order. That made me smile. Actually smile, for the first time since this whole nightmare had started. Dana had followed through on her promise, and Reed was about to discover that actions had consequences. Real consequences that couldn't be sweet-talked or charmed away. "Good for her," I said. "She deserves better than a cheating piece of shit who can't keep his dick in his pants." Jerome glanced at me sideways. "What are you planning, Malcolm?" I looked at my house. Our house, Talia's and mine, though I supposed it was just mine now, and felt something cold and calculating settle in my chest. Reed thought this was over. He thought taking a bullet in the leg was payment enough for 6 months of destroying my marriage. He thought he could just limp away, lick his wounds, and move on to the next conquest. He was wrong. "I'm planning to practice law," I said simply. "I'm planning to use every skill I've learned in 15 years of criminal defense work to make sure that Reed understands the full cost of his lifestyle choices." Jerome parked in the driveway and turned to look at me. "Malcolm, I know you're hurt. I know you're angry, but I'm not angry anymore." I cut him off and realized it was true. The rage had burned itself out, leaving behind something much more dangerous. Purpose. I'm focused. There's a difference. We sat in the car for a moment, both of us staring at the house where my marriage had died, where my old life had ended and something new had begun. "Reed thinks this is over," I said finally. "He thinks paying the price of a bullet in the leg settles the debt. But he's forgotten something important." "What's that?" I opened the car door and stepped out into the Chicago evening, breathing in the crisp air and feeling more alive than I had in months. "I'm a lawyer," I said, "and lawyers don't just fight battles. They win wars." There's nothing quite like the smell of revenge served with a side of freshly brewed coffee. Jerome had arrived at my front door at 7 sharp the next morning, carrying a bag of McDonald's breakfast sandwiches and a cardboard tray with 2 large coffees that probably cost more than some people make in an hour. But it wasn't the food that made me smile. It was the manila folder tucked under his arm, thick with papers and practically vibrating with potential. "You look like shit," he said by way of greeting, which was probably accurate. I'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through possibilities and strategies like a chess grandmaster planning 20 moves ahead. "I feel fantastic," I replied, and meant it. For the first time in months, maybe years, I had a sense of purpose that went beyond billable hours and client meetings. This was personal. This was justice. This was going to be beautiful. We settled at my kitchen table. The same table where Talia and I used to have our morning coffee and discuss our days, back when I thought I knew what my life was about. That felt like a lifetime ago, though it had only been 48 hours since my world had imploded in spectacular fashion. Jerome opened the folder and spread its contents across the table like a dealer laying out cards. "You were right about Reed," he said, his voice carrying the kind of satisfaction that comes from proving a theory. "This bastard has quite the history." The first document he showed me was Reed's employment file from Cormark Industries, obtained through what Jerome diplomatically called professional channels. Translation: he'd called in a favor from someone who owed him one, which was how half the legal work in Chicago actually got done. Reed Marshall, Vice President of Business Development. 42 years old, married to Dana for 14 years, 2 kids, lived in a house in Wilmette that was probably worth more than most people's retirement funds. On paper, he looked like every other corporate success story you'd find in the suburbs, the kind of guy who coached Little League on weekends and grilled burgers at block parties. But dig a little deeper, and the picture got a lot more interesting. 3 different women, Jerome said, pointing to a series of incident reports that had been buried so deep in the company files they might as well have been classified. 3 separate accusations of sexual harassment over the past 5 years. All of them settled quietly, all of them covered up by Cormark's legal department. I picked up the first report, dated 3 years ago. Sarah Chun, marketing coordinator, age 26. She'd accused Reed of persistent, unwanted advances, inappropriate touching during business trips, and creating a hostile work environment. The complaint had been filed, investigated by an internal team that was clearly more interested in protecting the company than the victim, and ultimately resolved with a confidential settlement that probably included enough zeros to buy Sarah's silence. The second report was similar. Jennifer Walsh, sales associate, age 29. Same pattern of behavior, same internal investigation, same quiet settlement that made the problem disappear without addressing the root cause. The third was the most recent, filed just 8 months ago. Lisa Rodriguez, executive assistant, age 31. Her complaint was more detailed, more explicit, and included text messages and emails that painted Reed as exactly the kind of predator I'd suspected him to be from the moment I'd seen him stumbling down my stairs. "Son of a bitch," I muttered, reading through Lisa's statement. Reed had apparently used his position of authority to coerce sexual favors, promising promotions and threatening career consequences depending on how cooperative his targets were. It was textbook sexual harassment, the kind of behavior that should have gotten him fired and probably prosecuted. Instead, Cormark had paid Lisa a settlement that was reportedly in the mid-6 figures and transferred her to a different department where she wouldn't have to interact with Reed. Problem solved, at least from the company's perspective. "It gets better," Jerome said, pulling out another set of documents. "Guess who provided us with copies of all this?" I looked up from Lisa's complaint, intrigued. Getting access to sealed personnel files and confidential settlements wasn't easy, even for lawyers with connections. "Dana," Jerome said with a grin that was pure predator. "Reed's soon-to-be ex-wife. Turns out she works in HR at Cormark. Has for the past 6 years. And she's been keeping her own files on her husband's extracurricular activities. That was beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Dana hadn't just been playing the role of oblivious wife. She'd been documenting Reed's behavior, building a case against him one incident at a time. And now she was ready to use that ammunition in ways that Reed never saw coming. She came to the office yesterday afternoon," Jerome continued. "Walked in with 2 boxes of documents and a story that would make your blood boil. Apparently, she's known about Reed's affairs for years, but she stayed quiet for the kids' sake. Your phone call was the final straw. I could picture it. Dana sitting in our conference room, her marriage falling apart around her, finally ready to stop protecting the man who'd been systematically destroying other women's careers while he destroyed their marriage. There was something poetic about the timing, like the universe had decided that Reed's bill had finally come due. What does she want? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Full custody of the kids. Alimony that reflects Reed's actual earning potential. And she wants Reed to face consequences for what he's done to those women at Core-Mark. Jerome pulled out another document, this one with the Core-Mark Industries letterhead at the top. She also brought us this, Reed's morality clause. I scanned the contract language, feeling my smile grow wider with every paragraph. Like most executives at major corporations, Reed's employment agreement included a morality clause that allowed the company to terminate him for conduct that brought disrepute to the organization. Adultery, sexual harassment, creating liability for the company, all grounds for immediate dismissal without severance. The company doesn't know about the affair yet, Jerome said. They don't know that Reed was using company time and company resources to conduct his relationship with your wife. They don't know that their VP has been having unprotected sex with a married woman, creating potential liability issues if STDs or pregnancy had been involved. The wheels in my head were spinning so fast I could practically feel the heat from the friction. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about justice. Real justice, the kind that came with consequences that lasted longer than a bullet wound. Dana wants to testify, Jerome continued. She's willing to go on record about Reed's pattern of behavior, his history of affairs, his complete disregard for his marriage vows, and his professional responsibilities. She's also willing to provide testimony about the financial arrangements Reed made to keep his other victims quiet. I sat back in my chair, looking at the spread of documents across my kitchen table. Employment files, settlement agreements, internal memos, email printouts, financial records. It was like Christmas morning for a lawyer with a grudge. There's more, Jerome said, reaching into his briefcase. I made some calls yesterday. Turns out Reed's reputation in the industry isn't quite as sterling as his LinkedIn profile would suggest. Word is that Core-Mark has been looking for an excuse to get rid of him for months. Seems he's been taking credit for other people's work, padding his expense reports, and generally being the kind of executive that makes companies nervous about their liability exposure. He handed me a printout of an email chain between Core-Mark CEO and their head of legal. The subject line read, Reed Marshall, Liability Assessment. They've been building a case against him, Jerome explained, looking for a way to terminate him without triggering a wrongful dismissal lawsuit. They just needed the right ammunition. I looked at the pile of evidence on my table, enough ammunition to destroy Reed's career, his marriage, his reputation, and his financial security, all in one coordinated strike. It was more than I'd dared to hope for when I'd first started planning my counterattack. So what's our move? Jerome asked. I picked up my coffee and took a long sip, savoring both the caffeine and the moment. Reed had thought he could walk into my life, destroy my marriage, and walk away with nothing more than a limp to remind him of his mistakes. He'd underestimated the consequences of fucking with a man who'd spent 15 years learning how to destroy people legally and professionally. We're going to war, I said simply. And we're going to win it so completely that Reed will spend the rest of his life wishing he'd never learned my wife's name. Jerome's grin matched mine. I was hoping you'd say that. It was going to be a beautiful day. There's something deeply satisfying about walking into a corporate headquarters with enough legal firepower to level the building. Core-Mark Industries occupied 30 floors of prime Chicago real estate, all glass and steel, and the kind of modern architecture that screamed, "We have more money than God." The lobby was all marble and chrome, with abstract sculptures that probably cost more than most people's houses and a reception desk that looked like it belonged on a spaceship. Jerome and I walked through those polished doors like we owned the place, which in a way, we were about to. I was carrying a leather briefcase that contained enough documentation to destroy Reed's career and probably take a good chunk of Core-Mark's reputation down with him. Jerome had a matching case filled with legal papers that would make the company's lawyers weep into their expensive scotch. We looked good, professional, dangerous in the way that only lawyers carrying damning evidence can look dangerous. The elevator ride to the 30th floor gave me time to admire the view and think about how much I was going to enjoy the next hour. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago spread out below us like a kingdom waiting to be conquered. Somewhere out there, Reed was probably nursing his wounded leg and thinking the worst was behind him. Poor bastard had no idea the real war was just beginning. Patrick Sloan's corner office was exactly what you'd expect from a CEO who'd built his company from the ground up. Expensive furniture, awards covering the walls, and a view that probably added $1 million to the rent. Sloan himself was in his 50s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, the kind of man who'd clawed his way to the top and knew how to spot trouble from a mile away. He tried to be polite when his secretary ushered us in, offered coffee, asked about our drive downtown, made the kind of small talk that CEOs use to size up potential threats. But I could see the wariness in his eyes. When two lawyers show up unannounced at your corporate headquarters carrying briefcases and wearing expressions that could cut glass, it's never good news. "Gentlemen," Sloan said, settling behind his massive desk like it was a fortress wall. "What can I do for you today?" I didn't waste time with pleasantries. Time for playing games was over. "Your VP is a predator," I said, my voice flat and matter-of-fact. "And your company has been enabling it." The color drained from Sloan's face like someone had pulled a plug. He tried to maintain his composure, but I'd been reading people's reactions in courtrooms for 15 years. I knew guilt when I saw it. "I'm not sure what you're—" "Reed Marshall." Jerome cut him off, opening his briefcase with the kind of theatrical flair that comes from years of courtroom drama. 3 separate sexual harassment complaints over the past 5 years. All buried by your legal department. All settled with company money to buy silence. We'd rehearsed this presentation like a Broadway show, timing it for maximum impact. While Jerome was talking, I was pulling documents from my own case and spreading them across Sloan's polished desk like evidence in a murder trial. "Sarah Chun, Jennifer Walsh, Lisa Rodriguez," I said, placing each woman's complaint in front of him. 3 victims that we know about. God knows how many others decided not to report because they saw how your company handled these cases. Sloan stared at the papers like they were poisonous snakes. These matters were resolved internally. These matters were covered up, I corrected, swept under the rug to protect a serial predator who's been using his posy of his morality clause, creating potential liability for hostile workplace lawsuits from multiple victims. We're talking about a pattern of behavior that could cost your company millions in damages. Sloan was no fool. He'd built Core-Mark from nothing into a billion-dollar enterprise, and he hadn't done it by being sentimental about employees who threatened the company's bottom line. I could practically see him adding up the numbers: legal fees, settlement costs, regulatory investigations, damage to the company's reputation. "What do you want?" he asked, and those 4 words told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't going to fight us. He wasn't going to defend Reed. He was ready to cut his losses and move on. But I wasn't ready to make it that easy for him. "Reed destroyed my marriage," I said, leaning forward in my chair. "He violated my home, my wife, my life. He thought he could walk away from that with nothing more than a bullet scar to show for it." I pulled out one final document, a lawsuit that Jerome and I had drafted the night before, comprehensive enough to destroy both Reed and Core-Mark if we chose to file it. Hostile workplace environment, corporate negligence, failure to protect employees from known predators, conspiracy to cover up criminal behavior. I let each charge hang in the air like smoke from a fired gun. "We could file this today and watch your stock price crater while the media has a field day with Reed's history of sexual harassment." Sloan tried to negotiate, offering smaller settlements, alternative arrangements, anything to minimize the damage. But I learned a long time ago that you never negotiate from a position of strength. You dictate terms. 7 figures, I said simply. Public apologies to Reed's victims. Full cooperation in any criminal investigation. And Reed's immediate termination with forfeiture of all benefits and severance. The silence in that office was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Sloan stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time, recognizing that I wasn't just some cuckolded husband looking for revenge. I was a predator who'd found wounded prey, and I was going to extract every pound of flesh the law would allow. His silence cost more than he ever expected. I continued, standing up and straightening my tie. Reed thought screwing another man's wife was a victimless crime. Today he learns about consequences. Sloan reached for his phone, probably to call his legal department and start damage control. But the war was already over. Reed just didn't know it yet. As Jerome and I walked back through that marble lobby, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not satisfaction, that would come later. This was anticipation, the sweet knowledge that justice was about to be served with interest. Reed had started this war when he walked into my house and into my wife's bed. But I was going to finish it in ways he never saw coming. The view from this Santorini balcony is absolutely breathtaking. 3 years after my life exploded, I'm sitting where Talia and I were supposed to celebrate our anniversary, and I've never been happier. The irony tastes sweeter than the expensive wine in my glass. This villa costs more per week than most people earn monthly, but destroying Reed's life turned out to be surprisingly profitable. The 7-figure settlement from Cormark was just the beginning. Dana passed the bar last month. Dana Rowe again. She dropped Marshall the day her divorce finalized. At 36, she juggled law school with single motherhood, driven by determination that was beautiful to witness. She heads our family law division now, fierce and focused, protecting other women from men like her ex-husband. We're colleagues, maybe something more someday, but there's no rush. Reed? Last I heard, he's selling used cars at some strip mall outside St. Louis. The mighty have fallen hard. Between wrongful termination suits, workplace settlements, and divorce proceedings, he lost everything. House, country club membership, respect. His kids live with Dana full-time. He gets every other weekend, if he can afford gas money from Missouri. Beautiful part? It was all perfectly legal. No vigilante justice, just systematic consequences through proper channels. Reed built his life on lies and exploitation, assuming actions wouldn't have repercussions. Wrong assumption. Talia moved to California after our divorce. The prenup held. She got what she brought, nothing more. I rarely think about her now. Where love and anger once lived, there's just emptiness. Not bitter, not sad. Just nothing. The practice is thriving. Taking down corporate predators makes excellent advertising. Jerome and I hired 3 associates, considering a second office. Sometimes revenge isn't destroying enemies. It's rebuilding yourself so completely they become irrelevant footnotes in your success story. The phone call came while I was watching the sunset from my terrace in Santorini, a glass of wine in one hand, and the peaceful satisfaction of a man who'd rebuilt his life exactly the way he wanted it. Jerome's voice crackled through the international connection, carrying news that should have hit me harder than it did. Talia came by the office today, he said without preamble. She looked rough, Malcolm. Really rough. I took a slow sip of wine, watching the sun sink toward the horizon like a golden coin dropped into the sea. What did she want? She's sick. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Maybe 6 months left, according to her doctors. She wanted to see you. Wanted to. Jerome's voice trailed off, searching for the right words. She wanted to make amends, I think. Asked me to give her your number. I should have felt something at that news. Shock, sadness, maybe even a flicker of the love I'd once carried for her. Instead, there was just a quiet emptiness where those emotions used to live, like an old wound that had healed so completely it didn't even ache anymore. I told her I'd pass along the message, but couldn't give out your contact information without your permission, Jerome continued. What do you want me to tell her? The answer came without hesitation, clear and final as the sound of waves against the cliffs below. Tell her no. Malcolm. Tell her no, Jerome. I'm not interested in deathbed confessions or last-minute apologies. She made her choices 3 years ago, and I've made mine. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jerome had been my partner and friend for over a decade, had seen me through the worst period of my life, and he understood better than anyone how completely I'd moved beyond the wreckage of my marriage. Are you sure? She seemed genuinely remorseful. I'm sure. I set down my wine glass and leaned back in my chair, feeling nothing but peace with the decision. Talia had her path, Jerome. She chose it freely, knowing the consequences. I had mine, and I chose it just as deliberately. Some stories don't need a final chapter. That night, after Jerome hung up, I sat under the Santorini stars thinking about closure and what it actually means. Most people think closure has to be loud. Dramatic confrontations, tearful apologies, grand gestures of forgiveness or revenge. But sometimes the deepest kind of closure is quiet, subtle, As simple as realizing that someone who once meant everything to you has become just another stranger whose problems are no longer your concern. Talia was dying, and I felt nothing. Not satisfaction at her suffering, not grief for what we'd lost, not even curiosity about what she might have wanted to say. She'd become a footnote in the story of my life, relevant only as the catalyst that had pushed me towards something better. The man who'd sat in that recliner 3 years ago, gun in his lap and heart full of rage, would probably have taken her call, would have listened to her apologies, maybe even offered forgiveness in her final months. But that man was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more selective about who deserved access to his emotional energy. I raised my glass to the Mediterranean sky, toasting not Talia's impending death, but my own rebirth. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone else. It's about rebuilding yourself so completely that they become irrelevant to your happiness. And sometimes the sweetest victory is simply not caring anymore.